Thank you for having me. As Chris said, my name is Kobe. I go by Kobeism online pretty much everywhere, GitHub, Twitter, whatever. And I work for GitHub. Now, can I get a quick show of hands? Has anyone here heard of GitHub? A few people, okay. People use GitHub? Okay, that's pretty impressive, nice work. Okay, that's awesome. So, as some of you probably know, GitHub is based in the States, in San Francisco. I live here, I don't live in the States. I work remotely, as do a lot of people at GitHub. The other day I asked, can you see that? All right, yeah. So I asked our chat robot Hubot how many of us were remote the other day, and 115 out of 198 people are currently remote at GitHub. So this is probably it's normally around 60-65%, but we just had our company summit recently in San Francisco, so a lot of people are still hanging out there. So yeah, a lot of GitHub is remote. But I'm not going to talk about GitHub too much today. Today I'm going to talk about how design fits into the realm of open source. And through working with GitHub, I'm lucky enough to have a lot of exposure to the open source community and some of the issues that surround getting involved with it, because it's a big challenge that we face with a lot of the people who use GitHub. So at the moment, the status quo is that not a lot of designers work in open source. I think that's a fairly fair statement to say. It's largely dominated by programmers, by systems people who work in much more technical roles than we do as designers. Sorry, I forgot to mention, I work as a designer for GitHub, for the most part. We don't have a lot of job titles and labels at GitHub, so kind of not something I think about a lot, which is why I kind of forgot to even mention it. But so yeah, there we go. So another one of the observations that I make is that it can be really intimidating to get started in open source. As a designer and someone who's not a programmer or a technical, working with technical programming subject material on a daily basis, it can be really intimidating to know where to get started, because you're not part of the club, if you will. Or at least that's the way it can seem. It's also not always very intuitive to know how to get help as you're getting started. There's a lot of help on technical resources. You can always look up tutorials on how to do technical stuff, but learning how to get into a community and how to participate in an open source community, there's very little tutorials on that. So it can be really intimidating and unintuitive. Another observation I make is that there's not a lot of good tools for designers working in open source. And the tools that do exist aren't necessarily easy to find. So I've got a few goals for this talk, and that is I want to help lower some of the perceived barriers to open source. I want to give you some direction, some examples, and some resources that you can use to take away and go and have a go at getting into open source if you're not already involved. And I want to share a few tools that help make it all easier. But before we kind of get into any of those things, the first thing I really need to do is ask a question that isn't actually asked very often. That is, what does open source software even mean? A lot of people talk about open source and open source software, but not many people ever really stop and actually ask, well, what does it mean? Because as someone new to this whole community, people talk about this thing and you don't even know what it means, and that's really difficult. So, to answer this question, the first thing I'm going to do is focus on software. Now, software, you probably have some conception in your mind of what that is, but for the context of the discussion of how design relates to open source, I want to clarify a few things. The thing you probably have in mind is native applications of software. The things you use on your computer, the programs you double-click and run, or single-click, whatever your preferences are software. Mobile applications are software. These are the kind of things you typically think of when you think of software. A lot of people also realize that web applications are software. Even though they run in your browser, they're still software on their own that's separate from the web browser. What most of you probably also may not necessarily have in your definition of software is that websites are also software. They may not necessarily contain much functionality. They may be based on content, but they're still software. It's still code running in your browser. Themes and plugins are software on their own. Even though they are for another piece of software, they're still a distinct item of software in the context I'm talking about. Frameworks are software as well. The things that people use to build the themes and the plugins and the web applications, and these are often subcomponents that are software on their own. Documentation is also software. This is a tricky one because it's not the actual software, but it's the instructions and the explanations that clarify how to use a piece of software their words and punctuation and numbers and examples of how to use something, that's the same as the words and letters and punctuation that make up the code that runs a web application. It's a very similar concept. Ideas and specifications can also be software. For example, there's a thing called mentoring. There's a mentoring project, which is basically it's just an idea for how to do impromptu mentoring that someone has started and put online, and people have taken that concept and changed it, and they've taken an idea and used it as software as well. Same thing with specifications. Look up if you Google for semantic versioning, it's a specification for how to increment the version numbers of software. It's not an implementation that does this for you. It's the definition of the method. It's the definition of the idea. And that can be powerful as software as well. Books and knowledge can also be software. Just in the same way that documentation can be software. This is probably outside of the scope of this talk, but it's, again, something you can consider software in the sense that I'm talking. So next, let's talk about the open source part of this question. What does open source mean? Now, open source usually means a few things, and there's always a few caveats here, but the first thing you usually notice about open source software is that it's free. You don't have to pay for it, or at least you usually don't have to pay for it. Again, all these have caveats in certain situations. It's usually free as in speech. It means that you can take a project and run with it. You can use it commercially, you can use it privately, you can modify it, you can redistribute it, you can do all kinds of things with it that you can't necessarily do with something that you're paying for a proprietary piece of software. Open source usually means that it's built by a community. It starts off being built by a single person, but it usually means that even if it is a single person, it's something that volunteers can jump in on, and that they are open to it being built by a community of people. When something is built amongst a community, what's important is that improvements that certain members of that community make are shared back to the main project, so that everyone in that community can benefit from the results that one person has made. And when you take this and apply it on a large scale, it means that the software can become very high quality very quickly. But this is all kind of, what I'd like to do instead is try and talk about what open source is using an analogy that most of you are probably reasonably familiar with, and that is viewing the source of a web page. The web has always been open, essentially. We've always been able to, since the early days of the internet, right-click a web page and view the source and see the code that actually makes the interface be what it is. That is essentially that's a good analogy for open source, except open source takes that concept of viewing source and applies it to all of these different types of software, not just the front-end code that powers it in your browser. It applies it to the back-end code, it applies it to the database and systems code, it applies it to the native apps that don't have a web-based front-end, it applies it to the documentation and everything else, so that it gives you visibility to the rest of this whole spectrum. But not only does it give you visibility into it, it takes these arrows and it makes them double-ended, because you can contribute back. You can do more than just view it. You can actually, if you see something that needs to be changed or that you think can be an improvement, then you can actually contribute that back to the project, and that makes it really powerful. So another question that isn't really often asked is this question, which is what this whole talk is all about, and that is how does design fit into open source? Does it fit into open source? And I think it does. As designers, there's often a stereotype stereotype, a good word, a stereotype that a lot of people have about us as designers in the rest of the community. Designers often say that we're secretive about our work, and that I think is because we often design in this mindset, and that is we collect feedback, we ask for input, we show something off, and we take the feedback and the input, we go away, we work on it at our own little secret kind of method, and then when we feel it's ready, when we feel confident, we then show it to people again. And that can appear secretive to the outside. There's a really good article on this, and I'm not going to go into this whole subject right now, but if you can Google designing in the open and find this article by Ryan Singer from 37 Signals, the guys that do Basecamp, there's a really, really good article about this whole mindset problem of designing in the open versus designing in secret. Highly recommend you read that. And this kind of leads me to a bit of a digression I want to go on, and that is, I think, labels are bullshit. This is why I kind of was almost reluctant to talk about this topic, because I think, let me explain. So when you close off disciplines from one another, when you silo off designers from developers, from database engineers, if you silo off these areas of expertise, it's a recipe for disaster when you're aiming to produce software. Because what happens is people design thinking that they just design for this waterfall approach of the designers do their thing, and then it gets passed to developers, and they do their thing, and then it passes to the operations guys, and they set it up and deploy it, and then it gets, given to the client, or whatever, at the end of the day. And it's a horrible way to work, because the designers see the things that gets deployed, and they say, well, the developers screwed it up, and the developers see what they get from the designers, and they say, well, they don't realize that that's difficult to implement, it's not even part of the database, and they're like, it just brings this whole conflict. And the whole designers versus developers thing is something that a lot of people feel is a very real thing. I think it's a real problem. And the reason it's a problem is that people's skill sets just fall into different parts of a really wide spectrum, all the way from low-level systems and operating system engineers, through to network people who work with distributed systems, to database engineers, to application developers, to front-end developers, to people who might write some JavaScript, but mostly kind of a design and visual person. People who just deal with wireframes and look at information architecture and workflows. To people who think about the business problems. It's a really wide spectrum, and people's expertise it's not necessarily continuous either. Someone can be a really great database developer and care about design. And this is something that we found at GitHub, was that we have this thing called team mentions, where in a comment or a discussion thread, you can @mention a whole team, not just a single user, a single person. So you go @GitHub/ and the team name is designers. And this was causing a lot of problems, because what happened was there were people who weren't designers that wanted to be mentioned, that wanted to get notifications because they cared about the design aspect of things. They might have been a database engineer, they might have been a systems engineer, but they care about design. So we changed the name, and now there's people on this team that put themselves there because they want to get mentioned when the GitHub design team is mentioned. Even though it's not necessarily the thing they do in their day-to-day work, they still care about it. And the reason for that is design is a philosophy. It's not just a profession. As a designer, you're a practitioner of it, but really it's a philosophy. So is engineering. That's the flip side of it. So this applies to all kinds of things. And as soon as you start getting away from these labels of I'm a designer, I'm a developer, you start to realize, well, if the end product is quality software, then designers, why can't we go the other way? Why can't we start to learn how to code? And this is something that Kyle Lee put really well, because he also looked at the flip side and says, well, engineers, why can't you design? This is how you build quality software. If you break down the labels and move past them, all you'll be focusing on is the end result, and that's what creates quality software. Again, this is a big digression because it's not nothing to do with design and open source. Well, it does, but the reason it has something to do with design and open source is that this is kind of my answer after that whole digression. That is, design is as necessary as engineering in the realm of open source. And if you look at the status quo of open source, the imbalance between design and development, I think this is kind of interesting. So, if this is the case, then we need to get more comfortable working in the open as designers, and we need to work out how. Firstly, before I get into how, some of the ways, one of the things I really want to highlight here is that there are more ways to contribute to open source than just writing actual code. This is something that not a lot of people think about. You can help improve the documentation of a project. You don't need to even be a designer. These are things that anyone can get into. Read the documentation, suggest improvements, fix typos, suggest rephrasing. These are things that if you can speak English, you can help with. Actually take the documentation and the instructions, try it out on your computer, see what breaks, file issues when things don't work. That's incredibly helpful. If you're a maintainer of an open source software and you get a bug report saying you can't even install a thing, that's more important than an upgrade to an existing feature. It's hugely important. As a maintainer, if you have someone helping to replicate and verify the issues that other people come up with, this is hugely helpful. If you can see someone's bug report and say, well, yeah, it sounds kind of odd, but then you have a second person come in and say, no, I actually did this on my machine. You know it's more than one person that has experienced the same problem, so it's much more likely it's going to be a legitimate bug. Review the other people's code that they submit. This is a great way to learn how to code. You can see the changes that people are making on a day-to-day process to an open source project. And this is a great way to learn. You don't even have to communicate. You can be completely passive. Or, as you start noticing things, you can suggest improvements. Discuss features with maintainers. Come up with a wish list of things that you would love to see in an open source project that you use, and talk to people about them. This is important to maintainers. And share your experiences. Write a blog post on this thing that you learned how to use on the weekend. Take a software project, and you don't even have to know the inner workings of it. Just take the project and try and install it. Try and set up something on it. Try and use it and share your experiences with it. Tell the people who maintain the project that you're doing it. Share a link with them, and they'll value that. It's really helpful to see a continuous experience, a write-up of a continuous experience that someone's had using your project. It's hugely valuable. And create mock-ups, especially if you're a designer. Help the people maintaining the project, especially if they're developers and aren't designers themselves, help them visualize how awesome it could be. Now, this is one thing that kind of looking at all of the ways you can contribute to open source as a designer, it's easier if you can bridge the gap to learning how to code, because it opens up a whole other set of possibilities of ways you can contribute. So I'm going to go on another little digression here, and that is that I want to talk about designing in the browser. Now this is a bit of a buzz phrase that people are talking about, but I think it's really important because I think this is the way the future is going. And if you're not already thinking with this kind of mindset, I think you really should be. Now, the core of this is expressed really well by Megan Fisher, who's an excellent designer. You can follow her on Twitter on Altastic. She said this quote in a blog post she wrote, which the link is down there. A design should start where it's going to live, in the browser. If you have to design something outside of the browser, in Photoshop or in another piece of software, and you get to a finished point, and then you have to re-implement the whole thing a second time, that takes a lot of work. And it can be really depressing to see that this pixel-perfect thing you did in Photoshop or whatever, it looks kind of off when it's converted into HTML and CSS. That can be really depressing as a design. That lowers the quality of the end result. There's all kinds of reasons that this is a good idea. But really, it comes down to tools. I wouldn't trade, there's a whole, Photoshop is great at a few things, but I wouldn't trade it for a lot of things. And I'm going to go through a few of the things that I think are really awesome tools that trump Photoshop. Live debugging CSS and JavaScript is amazing. Using CSS and preprocessors like Sass and Less that give you all sorts of new functionality to CSS becomes way more powerful in Photoshop. You can have colors that are variables, and you can add colors. You can do all kinds of things on the fly using algorithms. These are all designer tools, and yet they're in a developer's medium. They're in code, so it's hugely important to learn how to use these things because you can come up with some really amazing designs. Having font rendering not be a total shit show is a huge blessing. Why do you need 5 different options of ways you can anti-alias text? Just open it in your browser and it looks amazing. Retina is awesome. I don't even really know what to say here, because if you design something once at a fixed resolution, like that's what happens when more than when 4 times comes out and all these different things. Anyway, sorry. You can tell this is a bit of a run. Icon fonts are awesome. They're awesome. Use them. Web fonts, they're awesome most of the time. They're not great sometimes, but they're an amazing tool. Version. This is huge. I mean, I work at GitHub. This is what we do. But As a designer, having a history of the design decisions you make is amazing. Not just a history that persists in one session of using an application. Being able to design for things like hovers and clicks and swipes and all these different interactions that we have is hugely important. How often have you forgotten to completely design the loading state of something because you're designing the screens on either side of it in Photoshop? Also, this is another thing. I didn't want to call this I didn't want to put the heading here as being responsive because I actually call responsive something else. But the web has always been responsive. It was my theory is that it was only when we started designing stuff in Photoshop and going with pixel perfect things that we put this artificial layer of fixed width over HTML. So get rid of those tools. Go back to it being responsive by default. When I talk about responsiveness, I think more about speed. When I click something, does it respond? Do I get the new page straight away? Or does it take a few seconds to download the next page because I'm using assets that are 500 kilobytes? These things are important. There's nothing else except that experience to the end user, of the product. And if you care about the quality of your software, whether it's open source or not, this is important. But the reason I talk about all this is because this is the mindset you need to be in when you think about open source. When you're designing things for open source, it's much more important to be thinking in an open way and getting rid of tools that limit you. And I think designing in the browser can really do that. So, what are some of the, sorry, I'm just getting a drink. So I want to highlight some of the opportunities that I see for designers in open source. Like I said before, there's a huge gap between the number of developers and designers that are in open source, and I think there's a number of ways that we can get in there. The first is documentation space. Just about every project has documentation and needs it presented to people who are new to a piece of software in some way. So design a landing, go and find an open source project that just has plain text README and design a landing page for it. I did this recently for the Jekyll project, and it was an amazing experience because it's the first time I'd ever done a documentation site for an open source project. But I learned a lot. I actually learned how to use Jekyll by designing a documentation site. I didn't know beforehand. And it gave me an insight into how the actual piece of software works, and now I understand how the Jekyll project works. Get angry. What interface do you really, really hate using as a designer? Go and redesign it. You don't have to do it in code, but if you can, that's brilliant. There's so many things that I'd love to redesign. Create frameworks. If you ever find yourself doing something more than once, take that thing and try and generalize the problem a little bit. Take it and design something that you can use again the third time you have to do it. If it's worth doing once, then it's probably worth thinking about the problem a little more. Design themes and plugins. Do you use a text editor? Do you use a CMS? Do you use anything else that has themes or has plugins? Write a theme for it. It can be small. I have a jQuery plugin that's literally like 8 lines of code. Just because I had no idea how to write a jQuery plugin, so I used that as my first one. And it's easy to do because the text editors and content management systems and applications that use plugins, they have plenty of documentation for how to write one. This, I think, is a huge opportunity for designers in open source. There's so much publicly available data out there that is, Google BigQuery and all kinds of, there's all kinds of people putting out large volumes of free, publicly available information. Take it and build amazingly beautiful graphs and illustrations and infographics from it. D3.js, the other thing I point out down there, is an amazing way of doing that. There's brilliant documentation for it, and it's an amazing tool for visualizing data using a web browser. This is a big one. Developers develop for developers all the time. But when was the last time that you saw a designer designing for a designer? It's kind of crazy, but why don't you build your dream tool? If you don't like Photoshop, design the ultimate design tool. Even if it's just mock-ups. Have a stab at designing it as a thought exercise. Why don't we have, I think one of the reasons we don't have a lot of good tools is we haven't designed them ourselves. We know our workflow. Other people that have tried to design for the design workflow often fail, because we know it best and we're too busy doing other stuff. If you're a student or if you're starting out, if you want to go freelance, use open source as a chance to build portfolio work. This is, I mean, you don't get a better opportunity for it. You also don't get a better opportunity to build things that you want to do anyway. You don't, there's no one supervising you. It's not, you know, you're an adult, you can build whatever you want. It's an amazing opportunity, and I think more designers should take advantage of it. Have you ever wanted to get into designing fonts and type design? There are open source fonts out there. You can see how they're written. Adobe has a couple of really high quality open source fonts. Check them out. The real things. We don't have a burrito emoji. Someone should fix this. So now I want to go over some of the tools that I think are really important as designers to get familiar with. The first one is Jekyll, which I mentioned before, which is something that I helped on the site for, so you can go and blame me. Anyway. Jekyll is a static site generator. What that means is it takes it takes content and it outputs a static website. It sounds kind of, oops, sorry. Forgot to previous slide. So what this means is you can take things like Markdown and layouts and templates that are written in HTML, and it takes all of these things and it spits out a static site at the end. So what that means is you don't actually need to learn another language, like PHP or Ruby or any other of the programming languages. Jekyll just takes HTML templates, puts them together in the way that you describe, and spits out a static site generator. It understands Markdown, so you can write a new page or a new blog post just in Markdown without having to write the HTML for it. And it will convert it to HTML and put that as another post in your site, because it understands blogs. This is something that's an amazingly powerful tool. It's so simple. You can also write plugins for it. Have a go at writing a plugin if you want to have a go at something. GitHub Pages. This is the tool I use every day. It actually uses Jekyll on the back end. So, sorry, let me explain further. GitHub Pages are a repository on GitHub with a gh-pages branch, which you can look up how to do. And it's free web hosting. You can literally push whatever site files you want up to GitHub, and we will turn it into a web page at whatever your username is, .github.io. Or you can use custom domains if you want. I wish I found out that was like 5 years ago, because I would have used it from there. So check it out and use it, take advantage of it. And it uses Jekyll on the back end, so you can push up the Markdown file, or you can create it in the GitHub web interface, and have it turn into a live blog post in HTML. And it's a static site, so it's fast as hell. You don't have to worry about the database, you don't have to worry about anything, because it's not part of Jekyll. So GitHub Pages is hugely powerful, especially if you're doing things like building documentation sites, like I mentioned before, or if you're building a landing page for something, or if you want to quickly mock up something. Build a HTML prototype for something, and design individual screens, don't worry about the database, and just see how the workflow works going between screens. GitHub Pages and Jekyll are hugely powerful for that. If you do need a database, use Heroku. You can use Ruby. You can use PHP if you want. There's other services that will do that for you as well. You can use Python. You can use all kinds of things. But Heroku is amazing, and it's free. You can start a project, and until it gets a certain number of database records, you can use Heroku for free. You can also use GitHub for free if you're a student or a professor, or if you work in education. Check out github.com/edu, and you can find out how to get a free account. GitHub Workflow, this is something that I actually worked on as part of the site, and because and for a long time, it was only possible to edit files on GitHub, and that's not really much use. You need the file to be there, you need to know how to use Git to get it up there. There's all kinds of things you need to know how to do before you can even work with GitHub. But right now, using just a web browser, you can create a repository, you can create a file to start with, a README file, nothing else. You can create a branch, you can create all the files you want to build a Jekyll site if you want. You can open pull requests, merge branches. You can do all of these things without knowing how to use Git. You don't have to learn anymore. Well, it's helpful to, but especially it's helpful in the long run. But to start with, if you're wanting to try this stuff out, you can use it using just a web browser. This is, if you work with images or if you work with like rendered output for graphics, or if you're designing and slicing images for native applications or anything, on GitHub you can use image diffing, which is a hugely powerful thing. I'm not sure if you can see that very well, but essentially what happens is if you change a file on GitHub, in the pull request that you do to make that change, what you can do with the image is you can choose between any of these modes here, and you can actually slide back and forth, if you want, between the old image and the new image, or you can fade the images out, or you can overlay them and see the difference, or you can see them side by side at the different sizes or whatever. It's hugely useful. You don't have to learn the inner workings of Git on the command line. You can use GitHub for Mac, or GitHub for Windows, or GitHub for Eclipse, or whatever tool. Well, we don't. It's kind of those three. I lie. But you know, if the barrier for you is learning command line Git, don't worry about that. You start off with GitHub for Mac or GitHub for Windows. Give you a nice big sync button you can click and have it just sync. So the next thing I want to talk about is a few resources you can use to actually help learn and improve. There's a really good talk by Chris Coyier. I actually saw him give the talk live at CSF DevConf a little while ago, called How to Stay Up with Web Stuff, I think is the official title of the talk. Look it up, I think it's on SpeakerDeck. I should have probably had the URL there, but he gave a really good talk. He was actually the keynote speaker there. It was a really, really good talk on how to stay up to date with web stuff. And one of the things he highlighted in there was that there's actually a whole bunch of newsletters and regular monthly or weekly newsletters that you can sign up for, like HTML5 Weekly, CSS Weekly, JavaScript Weekly, Ruby Weekly. All these things will give you the new things that are coming out in whatever area you're interested in on a weekly basis in a nice email that's well grouped and curated for you. And it's a brilliant way to learn. It's not just for people who already know these things. This is how you learn, is by learning what's going on in the cutting edge. You don't have to learn the whole history of JavaScript. Start with what's happening right now. This is one of the best pieces of advice I can give you. If you're not a technical person and you're trying to learn something like Jekyll and you get an error and it's like, what do I do? Just do this, because Google and Stack Overflow are your friends. Mozilla Developer Network, use that. Look at things like Bootstrap. Look at the frameworks you use. Look at all kinds of things that you see people building in open source, and learn how they did it. Look at the code that powers it, and try and inspect it in Web Inspector and see why that hover thing does what it does. Learn how other people do it. That's one of the benefits of open source, is if you can see the complete inner workings of other people's projects, you can learn how they did it. I don't know about you, but doing the whole view source thing is how I learned how to design websites. That's kind of how I learned most of what I do. And now that we have a huge open source community, you can take that and apply it to everything, not just the front end code of websites. I mentioned this before, but there's actually quite a few people that have put up a mentoring page, like whatever the domain name is, .com/mentoring, and it's a page explaining how you can contact that person and set up a mentoring relationship. Go to this website. There's a few links to people's profiles that have people's websites that have started doing a mentoring thing. And this is hugely powerful. If you can contact someone who works in your profession and maybe does a lot of open source work that you can contact and ask questions privately before you take something public, or before someone you can get to review the work you're doing as you're learning how to contribute in open source. They can review the work before you send a pull request and make it public. It can give you a huge amount of confidence in the work you do. Also, if you feel confident in mentoring other people, this is a huge way to build community, especially in places like this that are kind of removed from what feels like where the whole rest, what everything cool is happening. Like, it's not San Francisco, it's Belfast. But this is how you build community, is by having real connections with people. whether they're here in face-to-face, or if you're having, a mentoring relationship with someone who's on the other side of the world. When I was in Australia, before I worked at GitHub, I actually got in touch with one of the people on this list, and it was hugely rewarding for me to connect with someone as a mentor and get advice on some of this stuff. Because in Australia, I felt like I was just some kid on the Gold Coast, like literally on the other side of the world from where all the cool stuff was happening. Well, that's what I thought. And I could connect with someone and I could ask them questions that I kind of saw things going on and wanted to know why that was even a problem or whatever. And I just asked them questions, and that was really helpful as I was getting started in open source and in the rest of the stuff that I do now. So my challenge to you is to find a project and try and contribute to it. Look at the documentation, see if you can learn some coding if you don't know how to do that already, and try and contribute. It's easy. I want to help you do it. So if you have any questions about that, get in touch with me. Thanks.